We come now to the urgent question in the name of Mr. Barry Gardiner.
Thank you, sir. To ask the Secretary of State for International Trade to make a statement on the progress he's made in replicating trade agreements between the UK and those countries with whom the EU has a trade agreement.
Short statement, then.
The Secretary of State for International Trade, Secretary Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the EU, the UK currently participates in around 40 free trade agreements with over 70 countries. In 2018, the trade agreements in force constituted around 11% of our trade. These free trade agreements cover a wide variety of relationships, including free trade agreements, economic partnership agreements with developing nations, and association agreements which cover broader economic and political cooperation, and mutual recognition agreements. The government's programme for providing continuity and stability for businesses, consumers and investors in our international agreements is of utmost importance. We're committed to ensuring these benefits are maintained, providing for a smooth transition as we leave the EU. Of course, the House will be well aware that the best way to provide that continuity and stability is to ensure that we have a deal with the European Union so that the UK can remain covered by all of these agreements during the implementation period. Mr. Speaker, we have already signed a number of agreements, including with Switzerland, the largest in terms of our trade flows, representing over 20% in terms of value of all our rollover agreements. We've also signed agreements with Chile and the Faroe Islands and an economic partnership agreement with Eastern and Southern Africa, and the text of these agreements, the explanatory memoranda and parliamentary reports for these agreements have already been laid in the libraries of both houses. As we leave the EU, we have no intention of making our developing country partners worse off, as the opposition would have us do by abandoning EPAs. And it's important for the prosperity of their people that we maintain our trading relationships so that they have the opportunity to lift themselves out of poverty. We have recently reached agreement with Israel and the Palestinian Authority and intend to sign those agreements shortly. And just today we have reached agreement on the UK Pacific EPA. We've also signed mutual recognition agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and will be closing 2 with the United States soon. A number of negotiations are at an advanced stage. As with all international negotiations, Mr. Speaker, and indeed any negotiations, they will go down to the wire, and I would expect nothing different from these agreements. That's the way that countries do business. To put the economic value of these agreements in perspective, countries covered by the 20 of the smallest agreements account for under 0.8% of all the UK's total trade. As for those countries where we may not be able to get a full agreement signed by exit day, it's responsible to ensure that we have contingencies in place should we end up, unfortunately, in a no-deal scenario. That's exactly what my department, alongside the FCO and the Department for International Development, are doing. We will shortly be updating businesses and the House with progress on these agreements, and will continue to inform the House as soon as further agreements are signed in line with our established parliamentary procedures.
Barry Gardiner.
Yesterday, the Department's risk matrix for the so-called rollover agreements was published in the media. Of the 40 agreements the Secretary of State famously promised would be ready 1 second after midnight on exit day, precisely 4 have been signed. 9 are off track, 19 significantly off track, 4 are not possible to be completed by March 2019, and 2 are not even being negotiated. Throughout the passage of the trade bill, members repeatedly raised concerns that it would not be possible to fully replicate the terms of these agreements, and that many countries would seek to renegotiate terms in their favour. I would therefore ask the Secretary of State if he'll write to me to set out for each country what objections or demands to concluding a new rollover have been presented, what concessions he's offered in respect of preferential access to UK markets in order to overcome such obstacles, what assessment he has made of the impact on trade flows with the UK of a failure to conclude a new deal. Many in the business community feel that the Secretary of State has diverted too much of his department's resources on entirely new free trade agreements, and so keen has he been to grandstand with the new that he's ignored the fundamental grinding work of securing what we already have. So I ask the Secretary of State to write and set out the number of full-time personnel engaged upon securing entirely new agreements, the number engaged upon securing the rollovers. I'd ask him to set out whether he believes his department has been adequately adequately resourced to handle so many trade negotiations at once. Recently, the Secretary of State suggested the unilateral liberalisation of tariffs in the event of a no-deal Brexit. I ask the Secretary of State to explain to the House now how he thinks negotiations would go with the remaining rollover countries once he'd given up our key negotiating leverage by reducing all tariffs to zero. Most members might think that by doing so, we were the ones being rolled over. Will he now categorically rule out such a proposal? Goods are being loaded onto vessels as we speak that will be arriving in our markets from overseas after the 29th of March. How does the Secretary of State intend to support business with these transactions when nobody knows what tariffs and non-tariff barriers they will face when they arrive at their destination port? Increasingly, Mr. Speaker, the Department of International Trade looks as if it has inadequate resources focused on the wrong priorities set by incompetent ministers.